Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today we're going to talk about Angkor Wat and some new clues regarding the civilization's decline. I did an episode on this, or this region rather, about some of the ruins and how they had really interesting sewage system and how they dealt with climate change 1,000+ years ago, and how they had very interesting city planning that help control the floods and keep water going through the city. But this time, this is more of a historical episode, and it has to do with the Khmer Empire and the construction of the city itself. If you guys don't know of it, it's really peculiar architecture, and the way the city was planned out is just so fascinating. And there's a lot of mystery surrounding this area, ranging from it being a sacred, holy site to having advanced or esoteric knowledge that helped them build the site. And also, a lot is made of the fact that it was built concurrently around the time that Gothic cathedrals were being built in Europe. And this was made more of a fact when they started unearthing Roman coins and stuff that obviously came from the Mediterranean long time ago in this region. And when I say this region, I'm talking about Indochina, where modern day Cambodia is. And yeah, they found stuff linking them to Rome and the Middle East. So, and that was way before the Gothic cathedrals. So the fact that stuff like this was being built around the same time during this warm period, the medieval warm period of climate, a lot of people like to make those connections to that architectural connection between the two societies were responsible for building stuff like Gothic cathedrals and stuff, and a city like Angkor Wat. Now, I'm not saying that there's definitely a link. I'm just telling you what's been said and what's out there, and all the different speculation and mystery that's around this region. So anyway, this guy, he's the king who founded the Khmer Empire. Not founded the Khmer Empire. He was like the third king, but he built Angkor Wat. He's responsible for it. His name is King Surya Varman II. He's one of the most famous kings of the Angkorian civilization that lasted from 800 AD to about 1430 something AD or 60 something AD. So that stretch of time during which that society was responsible for building these really interesting astronomically aligned sites, and aligned with the sun as well. Just a little, since we're going into history here, I think we should talk about the Khmer Empire itself. So before the Khmer Empire was founded, which was about 800 AD, so like the 9th century AD, it was it went through a couple phases, and it was a loose conglomeration of states. There was the earlier Funan, and then I forget what the second one is called. It starts with the C, Chalnan or something like that. Anyway, that's not what they called themselves. The earliest accounts of this region that survive are of these Chinese surveyors or visitors who were writing about what they saw, and they said that there was definitely an established system of living that they had here, and it was best described as a loose conglomeration of states. And then the medieval warm period happens, and the Khmer Empire takes over. Now, I'm not saying that's why the Khmer Empire rose, but it's very interesting that significant events like invasions or the rise of new systems or ideas tend to coincide with a rise in warmth. So just keep that in mind anyway. So, and then later they get taken over by the Thai kingdom, but that's neither here nor there. So a lot has been made as to why this decline happened. So this article is positing that Angkor's collapse should be better described as a transformation, and that could mean a lot of different things. So what happened exactly? So the first thing they mention is the Angkorian state was founded and grew during a period of favorable climate with abundant rainfall. So that's before they say anything, they're qualifying it with this, and this really is a significant detail that you should know, just because it's kind of setting the stage as to why things ended up going the way they were going. So at its height, Angkorian rulers might have controlled a large portion of mainland Southeast Asia. The civilization was booming in the early 1100s. Again, that's around the time these Gothic cathedrals were made. When construction began on the Angkor Wat temple site. Built as a recreation of the Hindu universe, its most striking features are the 5 sandstone towers that rise above the 4 temple enclosures. I think I have a picture. Well, I think there's a picture somewhere later. I'll have it as the thumbnail. So the temple is surrounded by the moat, symbolizing the sea of milk, and the elixir of immortality. That's what this is here. So things started changing. The last major stone temple, Angkor, was constructed in 1295. The latest Sanskrit inscription dates to the same year. So something was going on that they weren't writing things down with the regularity that they were before, and they weren't building things the way they were before, because these things, writing inscriptions and stone temples, they're elite activities. So to have a ruling elite, things need to be going smoothly, right? And part of that, again, is climate. These last instances at the Angkorian capital happened during the region-wide adoption of Theravada Buddhism that replaced Hinduism. Yeah, there was a new ideology that came in. Theravada Buddhism, if you guys don't know much about Buddhism, in a nutshell, there's two different branches. There's Theravada Buddhism, which is a more strict and more, I guess, not conservative, but it's more principled and, yeah, I guess, stricter version of Buddhism, more ascetic. And then there's Mahayana, which is more for the everyman. It's a lot more loose in what is allowed and what isn't allowed and stuff. Anyway, so that ideology and that religion replaced Hinduism, which was the foundation of the Khmer Empire. So right then and there, there's a lot that could have happened just with that description alone. So this religious shift disrupted the pre-existing Hindu-based power structures. Emphasis moved from state-sponsored stone temples and royal bureaucracy to community-based Buddhist pagodas built from wood. So yeah, so the power shifted from the ruling class to the community-based everyman, I suppose, if you want to be really, really vague and put on a fat label. The relocation of the capital further south near the modern capital of Phnom Penh allowed rulers to take advantage of these economic opportunities. Paleoclimate research has highlighted region-wide environmental changes that were taking place at the time too. A series of decades-long droughts interspersed with heavy monsoons disrupted Angkor's water management network. That's what my last video was about, their water management network, which was very advanced and very, very unique. But it got disrupted because, again, there was an interruption in the climate. Things weren't, the medieval warm period was changing. And that's a great way to cause instability in an otherwise working society. And then from there you have people get desperate, and then the people get desperate, they hijack certain things like ideology, they weaponize ideology, they take advantage of the disarray, and then they seize power. And that seems to be what happened here. But the precursor was that shift in climate. So the city's elite were already departing by the 14th century, almost 100 years before the supposed sack of the capital. So the archaeologists are suggesting this because they studied the moats around the walled, one of the walled temples, and people were so the writing was on the wall for them. So it must have been a slow burn if people, especially the ruling class, were already leaving and basically running for their lives, essentially. Instead of focusing at, oh, by the way, this article is written by the archaeologist himself in charge of the study. So it's very, very interesting because we're getting the primary straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And I'm not saying that he's absolutely right, but he's someone who's qualified, who has a qualified opinion, because he he's boots on the ground at the site. Okay, so instead of focusing on the temple itself, we looked at the occupation mounds surrounding the temple. People would have constructed houses and lived on top of these mounds. LiDAR surveys in the region clarified that Angkor Wat and many other temples were surrounded by a grid system of mounds within their enclosures. So that reminds me of the Maya and some of the videos I did about modern day Nicaragua and Belize. They ran LiDAR around there, and they also found similar mounds and grids as well. And again, these two civilizations, maybe their commonalities are more than just coincidence. And especially if you look at the ocean as not as a barrier, but as like a conveyor belt of travel, intercontinental travel, because it seems like a safe assumption that they were aware of the tides and the currents, and that there wasn't just a vast infinite expanse of ocean. It seemed like now that it was, with more and more stuff coming out, that it was understood that there were boats. I mean, the oldest boats they found were 42,000 years ago, so they must have been familiar with that. And yeah, if that's true, then maybe the grid system in both continents at around the same time period is not a coincidence. Anyway, over 3 field seasons, my colleagues and I excavated these mounds, uncovering remains of dumps of ceramics, hearths, burnt food, post holes, flat-lying stones that might have been part of a floor, surface, or path. Inscriptions describe the thousands of people needed to keep the temples functioning, so we suspect that many of those who lived on the mounds worked in some capacity in the Angkor Wat temple. Yeah, they must have needed a lot of people to build it. And again, in order to even take on a monumental task such as temple building with manual labor and these giant stones, you need to have a detailed plan, you need to be educated in some way, and in order to have a group of people like that, what I just described, qualified in those ways, there has to be a whole infrastructure before in place that could have supported that education and provided the infrastructure for success or knowledge, continued knowledge of something like architecture. So long story short, this wasn't just a random king who just seized power and just forced people to do all the work. There's a little bit of that, but also some planning as well. There's a lot of people involved that were planning something like the temple, which is again astronomically aligned, and solar is aligned with the sun. So radiocarbon dates, our dates show that the landscape around Angkor Wat might have initially been inhabited in the 11th century prior to the temple's construction in the early 12th century. So the place that they're excavating is like a community or something right around, right before the temple's construction. So he thinks it's like an encampment of people, or a makeshift town or something, or a giant neighborhood, because again there's a mound pond grid system. So mounds are typically associated with communities, especially dense communities, because a lot of times the mounds are these midden heaps, or they start out that way. So in order to get a mound, you need to have a bunch of people living in the same spot for an extended period of time. So then he says there's a gap in the radiocarbon dates. It likely ranges from the 12th or early 13th century to the late 14th or early 15th century. That's when the climate started changing, and then the gap coinciding with many changes taking place in the kingdom. And the occupation mounds were abandoned and their uses transformed during this period. Yeah, the people cleared out, and then some time passed, and then that area was ripe for the taking to occupy by probably someone else, and someone who had nothing to do with the previous people living there, and then hence their use is transformed. The temple itself was never abandoned, though. Why would it be? It's such a sacred place. I don't think, unless there was like a super violent, complete, full-scale invasion of someone else, some other group of people with completely different values. Like if it was like the Romans, then yeah, maybe it would have been burnt down. But this was not abandoned. The landscape surrounding the temple appears to be reoccupied by the 14th and 15th centuries. During the period, Angkor was supposedly sacked and abandoned by the Thai kingdom, used until the 17th or 18th centuries. seems to have undergone transformations at the same time that the broader Angkorian society was also reorganizing. So that's why they think it's more of a transformation. It's just a shuffling of faces, but they kept the temple intact because, again, Hinduism and Buddhism, even though they're different ideologies, they're very, very similar and intertwined with each other. So that means stuff that they hold sacred may also carry over to the other religion. So, and Angkor Wat was probably seen by the Thai Buddhists at the time of being a sacred site worth saving and occupying. While it seems clear that the city experienced a demographic shift, certain key parts of the landscape were not deserted. People returned to Angkor Wat and its surrounding enclosure during the period that historical chronicles say the city was being attacked. So again, historical chronicles they're conflicting stories with the archaeological evidence. So again, this is something that will have to be monitored and really examined closely to get to the bottom of reality of what was likely to have happened. To describe Angkor's decline as a collapse was a misnomer. The Angkorian people were reorganizing and adapting to a variety of turbulent changing conditions, including weather and ideology and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a lot more complex than it looks. If you guys know anything about the Khmer Empire or this area, the history, let me know. I think it's a very, very interesting article. And I think the history of this area is far further than what we know already. Because again, the earliest accounts, earliest detailed accounts that we have date to around the 1st century AD by these Chinese. It's a Chinese account, so it's not even a first-hand account by the people themselves. But we know that the history goes further back because of a bunch of different archaeological things that we found, such as stuff from Rome that traces back to Rome was there. So there's a prevailing thought that that area was an economic powerhouse, like a trade route or something, just by location and by climate at the time. And typically those places that have that's a habitable zone that is also a crossroads for so many different power countries or entities, whatever you want to call it, socio-political, geopolitical center, economic center, as a crossroads between all those different countries. Yeah, it seems like they would have been relevant for a long time. But it's interesting that a place of such significance, their historical records don't go as far back as you would think. So I think there's a lot to this story. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll talk to you guys later.